They said the frontier was no place for a lone woman, especially one who carried more grief than grain in her cupboards. But every night, Eleanor Hart lit the lamp in her tiny cabin and whispered to the darkness that she was not afraid. She lied. The wolves outside howled, the wind scraped the walls like claws, and memories of her husband kept her awake more than any danger. Yet nothing, prepared her for the night a wounded gunman staggered into her cabin, collapsed on her floor, and changed her life in a way she never imagined. Eleanor had lived on the edge of the frontier for 3 years, ever since her husband Matthew died in a logging accident that broke more than just his bones. It broke the home they dreamed of building together. The Hart cabin was not much, 2 rooms and a porch that leaned like an old man, but it was all she had left of the men who once promised her a life filled with laughter. Each evening she sat beside the fire, hands wrapped around her cup of weak tea, staring at the empty chair across from her. She told herself she stayed because Matthew would have wanted her to finish what they started. But the truth was simpler and sadder. She had nowhere else to go. The nights were the hardest. Out on the frontier, silence wasn't comforting, it was a warning. Coyotes cried in the distance, wind rattled loose shingles, and the lantern cast long, trembling shadows on the walls. Eleanor often wondered when fear had become her closest companion. Still, she locked her door, prayed softly, and waited for dawn like it was an overdue friend. On one particularly cold night, snow drifted against the windows and the fire burned low, forcing Eleanor to wrap her shawl closer. She was drifting between exhaustion and vigilance when a sudden thud hit her door, heavy, urgent, nothing like the restless beat of the wind. She froze. Another thud came, then a groan. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared whatever was outside might hear it. She reached instinctively for the hunting rifle Matthew left behind, though she knew she barely remembered how to fire it. "Who's there?" she called, voice quivering. No answer. Only another weak thud, then the slump of weight sliding down her door. Eleanor tiptoed to the window, lifting the curtain by just an inch. A man lay in the snow, face pale, chest rising in short, shallow breaths. Even in the dim moonlight, she saw the dark stain of blood spreading across his shirt. She hesitated, terrified that opening her door might invite death inside, but leaving him to freeze felt like a sin she couldn't bear. With trembling hands she unlatched the door, dragging the barely conscious stranger inside. He was tall, rugged, and wore the dusty coat of a man who lived by the gun. A holster hung at his hip, but the revolver was missing. His face, though hardened by sun and hardship, softened the moment cold air left his lungs. Eleanor placed him by the fire, her heart racing with every breath he took. For hours she worked, cleaning the wound, stitching torn flesh, whispering to God to guide her shaking hands. The stranger muttered fragments of words. Ambush, wrong man, didn't mean, before slipping back into the dark. Eleanor sat beside him through the night, her fear slowly replaced by an unexpected protectiveness. She didn't know who he was or what trouble followed him, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. Something about his presence, even in unconsciousness, reminded her that she was still capable of bravery. When dawn finally spilled into the cabin, the gunman opened his eyes. They were sharp, storm gray, and filled with instinctive distrust, until he saw her. "You saved me," he whispered, voice rough as gravel. Eleanor nodded, unsure what came next. She had no idea that this man, this stranger, was about to turn her quiet, lonely world upside down. His name was Callan Ridge, a former lawman turned drifter, or so he told her once he could sit upright without wincing. Days passed, snow deepened, and his wound healed just enough to allow him short walks around the cabin. Eleanor learned he had been tracking a band of outlaws for months, men who believed he had something they wanted, though he refused to say what. Trouble, he implied, might not be far behind him. Eleanor should have been frightened. Instead, she found herself strangely calm. Danger had always lived outside her cabin. This was the first time she felt she had someone strong enough to stand between her and it. Callan tried to leave on the third morning, insisting he didn't want to bring danger to her door. But after nearly collapsing in the snow, Eleanor forced him back inside with a firmness that surprised even herself. That afternoon, as she stirred broth over the fire, Callan watched her with quiet curiosity. "You've lost someone," he finally said, not as a question but as an understanding. Eleanor swallowed hard, the memories thick in her throat. "My husband. 3 years gone." Callan nodded as though he carried a similar weight. "The frontier doesn't take gently," he said. "It takes like a thief." Slowly, they began to share pieces of themselves, stories told in the soft hours of evening while flames flickered across their faces. Eleanor spoke of Matthew, of the hopes buried with him. Callan shared fragments of a life marked by violence, justice, and regrets he didn't name. Their conversations were quiet but deep, the kind that stitched two lonely souls together without either noticing at first, but peace on the frontier never lasted long. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters, horses approached, dark silhouettes moving with purpose. Callan's face hardened instantly. "They found me," he whispered. The next moments blurred, Eleanor's breath hitched, Callan reached for the rifle she'd barely learned to hold, and footsteps crunched outside the door. Eleanor felt fear surge through her like a breaking dam, but this time she was not alone. Callan positioned himself beside the window, his expression sharp and steady despite his wound. Eleanor, unable to do more, stood behind him, praying silently just as she had the night he arrived. A voice outside called his name, cruel and mocking. Callan tensed, but he didn't step back. "You helped me," he whispered to Eleanor without turning. "I won't let them hurt you." What followed was brief, fierce, and terrifying. A gunshot shattered the stillness. Callan fired back with deadly precision, protecting the cabin, and Eleanor, with a determination that startled even him. When it ended, the attackers fled into the night, realizing their wounded prey was not the easy target they expected. Callan sagged against the wall, breath ragged. Eleanor rushed to him, hands trembling, but this time the fear she felt wasn't for herself, it was for him. "You came here by accident," she whispered, "but I don't want you to leave by force." Callan looked at her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "I won't leave," he said quietly, "not until you tell me to." The winter thawed slowly, but the silence inside the cabin changed. It was no longer empty, it was shared. Eleanor no longer checked the door each night out of fear, she checked it because she had something worth keeping safe. Callan, once a wandering gunman, found himself returning to the fire, to the warmth of a life he never thought he deserved. Two broken paths had crossed by chance, but together they began to look like something whole, and as spring approached, Eleanor realized something she never expected: she no longer lit the lamp at night to keep the darkness away. She lit it because she knew someone would be coming home.